Sounds like a good plan. I mean, I think in the interim, I just treat what is in here currently as a place to group chat with colleagues that I care about and stuff we have in common, you know,
Yes,
and
and we're going to continue feeding people until we get to that point where the launch, actually happens. But I was sharing with Aaron the plan for Next Wave Network, and how we're looking to mature it, into a university lab network, in the next few months, and then that'll launch. That'll take our hard launch. Um, okay, so here we are at our community lunch again today, and I don't have a lunch to share with you guys, but I'm going to share my time. We're back here with Aaron Collegeman, and we are developing an immersive, interactive application, that uses your phone and takes role play, specifically the basic Dungeons and Dragons, and empowers it with human connection and story. Uh, so, uh, so, Mr. College Man, I think today that we're going to be talking about some of the um, mechanics of how it might work, and exploring some of the D&D side. To you.
yeah, yeah. So first of all, I hadn't shared my screen until just now, and I want to make sure that we're capturing that in the recording. So Joanne, can you give me some sort of high sign that you're
You're all
you're
good.
capturing my
All good.
screen?
See you now.
Okay. All right. So now let me fiddle with this thing for a second. Why is this always so hard? There it is. Okay.
Okay,
So
Joanne? It's not focusing on the other one. Yep. On what Joanne is sharing. Now I can do it on my computer, but I can't do it on yours.
cool. Well, while she's doing that, I'll just use my voice to describe some things because I know that's being captured.
There we go.
Um, so, yes, that is what we've been doing, JJ. We've been talking about this awesome app. And just to give everybody a quick reminder of what the app is really meant to do, it's aimed at solving the problem that we think is very real, of wanting people to get out and touch grass. And the incentive that we're trying to give them is a familiar way of playing, which is role play games, like Dungeons and Dragons. And we're giving them all sorts of things in this space to try to enhance that experience and encourage them to do it. We're giving them an app. We're giving them a way within that app to connect with people that they meet in public who are playing the game. We're giving them a jersey that they can wear to advertise the fact that they're playing the game with a QR code on it that allows them to connect. And in our last session together, we took a close look at what that app might look like and feel like, up to the point of two people are connected, and now they're connected in the app and they're going to have an experience together. That much we've agreed on, right? That something some things about the background of this person that I just met, about the background of their character in the game, are going to inform a one shot sort of, and that's the D&D term, right? One shot sort of session experience where they're either enemies or frenemies or friends in some way. That's something that they get to choose as they're establishing their relationship with one another. And so in the interim between last meeting and this meeting, what I've been thinking about are two things, right? One, I've been thinking about the mechanics of Dungeons and Dragons, which is something that I don't have a real depth of knowledge on. So it's a learning experience for me. I know you have a much deeper knowledge on that subject than I do, and I hope for us to sort of explore some of that together today to expand what I understand about tabletop gaming and Dungeons and Dragons specifically. And the other thing that I've been thinking about, and you and I have been thinking about together for years now, is the the structure of story and the ways in which stories are organized and then those two things together, the gaming mechanics and the story mechanics, and backing up from that into some sort of information architecture that we can create a playable game on, right? Because that at the end of the day, all of this has to translate into something that's visual, right? Something that users can interact with, and and also something mechanical, something that the software can interact with and store data in a database and have rules that it can follow. So to sort of kick us off here, um, and I think we should probably, I don't know that we can pick those two things, the mechanics and the story are kind of really woven together. So I'm not sure we could talk about either one of them in isolation. So it might be messy for a few minutes. But let me stop there and see if I sort of set the table for the right conversation and the one that you were expecting to have with me today. Does that sound right?
Yes. Yes, yes. And the other thing is there are mechanics associated with the stories, right? So there's a
Yeah.
world story, right? There's a personal story. There's a what did you call it? A one-shot story, right?
Mhm.
And then there's an ongoing relational story, right? So I think we need to start with the personal story. Who am I? Because there's so many ways that we could do the world. Shoot, there's so many ways we can do all of them. But let's start with who am I, right? As
Mhm.
a person. And I think there are a number of decisions that have to be made at this point, right? So,
Mhm.
and these will begin to dictate our abilities inside of the interactive moment. So let's start with um, what we need to create our character, right?
Mhm.
And so, the beginning basic characters for D&D at the beginning, they didn't have as many as they have now, of course. And I mean, so fighter, of course, magic user, right? Because they hadn't split into wizard, sorcerer, or any of that stuff. I mean, I think they were all wizards.
Mhm.
Magic or wizards. So you got a magic user, you got a fighter, you got a thief,
Mhm.
and you have a cleric.
Keep going.
Um, you've also got the druid, the cleric who gets their magic from a god, the druid who gets their magic from nature. The truth of the matter is, we could make a magic user and then simply define, are you getting it from nature? Are you getting it from a god? Are you getting it from something else? And that defines what your magic is like. Either way, I
Yeah.
think we're I think we should look at 3 characters, and a magic user, a fighter, and a thief.
Okay.
And really, I think we could get rid of the thief if we wanted to start out with just 2 characters.
So a
Um,
magic user and a fighter.
yep.
And for the benefit of everybody at home, uh, the list that I just went and pulled is kind of what you were referring to there. Wizards of the Coast, who's the maker of Dungeons and Dragons, they have a set of rules called the Free Basic Rules, currently in the 5th edition 2024 version. And those rules are freely available for other people, us, to develop commercial games on top of, right? And so, one of the things that I've been referring back to as I try to learn more about this is that. Now, you know, also for the benefit of everybody who's not sort of initiated on this subject, the basic rules back up into the big rules, right? The master set of rules and characters and stories and monsters and worlds. There are 3 books that Wizards of the Coast produces, among many, that detail all of this stuff, right? And so the things that you've been talking about as we've been just sort of expanding upon what personal story is something that I understand to be called character class, right? And the
Yes.
character classes from the at least the 2018 edition, because I can't get the 2024 edition to come up for some reason, are right here in pink, right? Like you were saying, there's a lot of them, and it might be, if I understand you correctly, it might be that some of the differences between these things are not useful, or maybe more complicated than what your average person approaching this game might, you know, be willing to go down that path, right? And I guess
Yeah,
within that, I'm curious, like if somebody picked up this game, it's somebody who had been a Dungeons and Dragons player for years, like you have been, and they find that they can't be a monk, that they have to choose from magic user or fighter, is that a turnoff? You know, do
it
they
is.
decide they don't want to play?
I think it is a turnoff, which is why I think in my first imagining of this game, everybody was a goblin, right?
Okay.
And so it wasn't so much about building your favorite Dungeons and Dragons character as much as it was about getting out and interacting and telling a story and building a character, right? What I liked about goblins is nobody picks being a goblin, or few people pick being a goblin, um, we can do so much artistically with those characters. And so my thought originally was that you're a goblin and you're a fighter, and that's it, dude, right?
Yeah.
And you get better and you get different abilities and you get prettier and you get wackier, right? So part of my original thought would be, and we might want to consider this, is to make this a goblin's experience, right? Um,
Okay.
and so you've got these guys who are pretty weak, right? So,
Yeah.
in the beginning, how they choose to fight is almost about how they choose to escape, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so there's a lemmings element to this too, right? And what I like about that is it's playful and it's sort of a single world, and you can all kind of invest in the same thing versus us really building a rich monk world and us really building a rich sorcerer experience. The complexity of story inside of that is something that challenges me. What's your response to those thoughts?
I, I'm kind of still where I was. I think that when I think about software and user experience design principles, and I think about the goal that we have, which is getting as many people to get out and touch grass as possible by way of something that they can already kind of relate to. and
Hmm.
and I think this backs up into something that Tim is good at reminding us about, which is the adoption curve, and how your earliest adopters are your people who understand really well what it is you're trying to do, and they see the value of it right away. And so I think something like severely limiting, I use the word severe, narrowing the choices that a user has in class and race is a thing that might make early adopters not want to adopt it. And that might turn people off. But Tim, I evoked Tim there, so Tim should get to respond.
I heard my name, so I have to speak. When JJ when JJ mentioned goblins, I went back to over my note. And one thing I had about character creation, since it's supposed to have real world impact, was asking questions of people to get them to determine what they aspire to be. And then that way in the story, you can provide them with campaigns or missions or one-offs, these session stories that help them achieve that. And when JJ mentioned goblin, I thought, what if everyone starts as a goblin, but then as their story progresses, they're given choices like, hey, here's a magic box. If you open this, you'll have magic, but you'll lose this. If you don't open it, then you get something else, right? And that way, based on their choices, they evolve, their character evolves over time, just like they do as a person, instead of being framed in as one certain thing with one special features. You actually gain those elements as you move. That
Yeah,
was all I thought of.
I think that that's very outside of the reality of D&D, right? And the
Okay.
progression that people experience inside of Dungeons and Dragons. But I do like the idea of evolution of character for future
Hmm.
things.
Hmm.
Um,
Me too. Me too.
so, I mean, the truth of the matter is, if we give them the choice of all of the characters, right? Monk, whatever, we assign them what they do damage with, right? So everybody starts with one way of doing damage.
As
Um,
part of their class, right? That's a D&D
yeah,
mechanical
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Yep.
But instead of giving them choices between, let's say, not this, but magic missile and fireball, you start out with fireball, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Um, you're a fighter. You can start out with a long sword or two daggers,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And the reason being is that the longsword does greater damage, but two daggers gives you two chances of hit. And if you hit with both, your minimum is two instead of one. Um,
Yeah.
so,
I
and
like
they,
that. And from sort of a naive perspective, and backing up into what Tim was saying, like if all of these things that I've written here, skills, class, race, and backstory, I think all of these things are subject to the game mechanic of character evolution. And it's sort of like as you go along, it's like collecting cards, right? Like, oh, here's another form of attack that you just unlocked because you've played for a certain amount of time. Here's a skill that you've just unlocked. Here, but I think at the beginning, if our goal, and I think this is the way that I understand it, we want to embrace the sort of traditional mechanics and range, but find ways within those things to simplify. So a simplification might be the number of choices you have of class, but it might be easier to just simplify based on, well, what does it mean to pick that class? Does it mean you have all of these different things you can do, or does it mean you have this one thing that you can do? And
right.
that lowers the amount of information that new users have to learn in order to be able to participate. So that kind of strikes that balance between comfort for early adopters and lower amount of friction for people who are uninitiated and are really just learning as they go, right?
Well, and it evolves them as it evolves the character, right? And to Tim's
Mhm.
point, right? Let's create a character that evolves, right? And maybe it doesn't evolve racially, right? Or class wise, but it evolves inside of whatever, its character design is. So you
Yeah.
start out with a sword and, two experiences or the next experience, you find out that you whittle things, you know? Um, you get one of those skills, right? Because
Yeah.
that's one of the skills. Um,
Yeah.
and so, little by little, you add all of the pieces that are the character creation, but it happens organically in the process, right? For a lot of it, it happens step by step. You get to build the character as you get to fall in love with it, and then those elements get integrated into story. And so, what I've been thinking about is the layout of Canva AI as you're filling out the AI, right? Character that you're interacting with. Um, and you get all those different spaces that you can add in um, different pieces of information for that AI to, root. Um, uh, and so, what I've been thinking about is how those, if we add an element like you whittle, right?
Yeah.
Does the AI now remember that you're sitting on the water hole, finishing the unicorn that you started yesterday, you know? And somebody pulls it out of your hand and stomps on it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So there's a couple of different directions that you're going in here, and I want to just sort of plant some flags as we go. And first of all, just as sort of a thumbs up or thumbs down, Tim, did we do service to your thoughts there on character evolution? Are you good with that? Did you have anything else you wanted to slide in there?
Hey, no, I appreciate it. I'm like you, I'm not as familiar with the D&D world. Um, Two things came up just on that subject. One,
Yeah.
you could ask what experience do you have? Are you a novice, a beginner, an expert? And maybe experts get more options, and then new people come in and they have fewer choices, so they will amass learning over time instead of being required to do it all up front. That was a consideration. Um, so for those new users, like, Jay just said, oh, you start with a dagger, but if you complete a world task, now maybe you go from a dagger and you have an option to collect two swords or a fireball or
Yeah.
something, right? Like, so they
Yeah.
they amass things over time. That way you can describe each of those elements and their value over time to new novice players. But old somebody says, "Hey, I know what I'm doing," then you kind of can give them all the bells and whistles and let them make decisions earlier.
Yeah.
That was
So
the only thing. But yes, I appreciate you considering the evolution aspect.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, because I think it's important, but it's critical to the whole thing sort of being living and breathing, right? But the thing that I don't want to dwell on today, but I think is really really important is this healthy debate about when you first join this thing, what do we assign to you versus what do you choose for yourself, right? And I think like we could probably spend an hour just talking about the nuances of that. So I'm just going to highlight that for now and remember to come back to that. But that's this work. If we put it in the larger UX of somebody just joined this, they just connected with somebody, which is what gave them permission to sort of start the game. What choices do they have to make in order to start playing? And and just to plant a flag on it, I would say that class and race are maybe the thing that they have to decide, right? And that all the other little things sort of glom on from there. Yeah, and so the other thing, and like I said, there were kind of two directions here. That's direction number one, and I want to plant a flag on that. The other thing I want to plant a flag on goes back to story mechanics. I like this division and distinction between world, personal, and session. I would love this. The word that we use to describe this third story kind of changes from conversation to conversation. I want to try to lock one in. I don't know if that's the right one. So let's just linger there for just a second. So the delineation is you've got the world or worlds, but maybe just one world at the beginning. That's coming from our last conversation. And there's stuff that goes on in the world and things about it. And then you've got your personal story, which is the story that describes you, your character class, your race, your skills, your backstory, which is something that I think that we should talk a little bit about. And then you've got the session story, and the session to story is what describes a relationship between one or more players and an adventure that they're having as they play. And I think those three delineations are enough. And I think those three words are enough. Do you agree with that, JJ? Were you good for that? Okay. Love to lock that in. So
I
before
agree as long as those
oh,
relationship experiences when like that thing's completed, somehow that impacts the world.
so yes,
That
so
they're not
let's linger there
isolated
and yes,
until
yes, yes. Let's flesh that out a little bit and we'll come back and talk about backstory in a minute because this is I think we need to explore this just a little bit. So yes, so what are these things ultimately contributing and how does that work within the mechanics of the machine that's generating the story? I think that all three of these things contribute two kinds of information to the story. One is called facts, and the other one is called memories. Okay. And I think facts are a kind of state. Let me give you some examples. It's daytime, it's nighttime, right? The house is burning down, the house is not burning down. These are facts, right? And they're things that the game system is keeping track of and storing, much the way that the dungeon master has to store them, right? The dungeon master has to remember that there's a character that you're going to meet 3 hours from now, and that character has facts about them that the other people playing are going to learn when they come into contact. But those facts are persistent. They don't change, right? Until maybe you interact with them and then maybe they do. The other thing that is generated is something that I'm going to call memories. And memories are two things. But primarily they're things that happen as the game progresses, right? So a memory about that house in that village might be that once it was a beautiful place where people came to congregate and had wonderful times together and ate good food until the day that the goblins attacked and burned it down. And that's a memory of a place. And that's a memory that exists in the world And versions of that happening might exist in personal stories, in the backstories. There might have been a character whose first adventure was that that house in the village burning down. And so there's an entry in their personal story that is a memory that describes that. And then there's the session where there might have been a group of players who were at that house the day that it burned down. And so there is a log in that. And so somehow, through much machination, the game system and the large language model comes up with what it's going to say. It generates what the next thing is in the session story based on taking together all of these memories and facts to form what's called context, right? So context is a large language model thing. One might also call it a prompt, right? And you're building this system prompt that includes things like there once was a house here, but then it burned down. And JJ's character experienced it burning down, and Tim's character heard about it burning down, right? And all of that gets put into the large language model before you say what? Before you say our characters encounter a goblin on the road. What does the goblin have to say? And that's when the generative system takes over and it comes up with something that's contextually relevant to all of these things. So that's I want to plant a flag on this too. It's this concept of facts and memories and the idea that all three of these kinds of stories are producing both of these kinds of information. And that what makes the game engine work is that it organizes and catalogs these things and can query them and bring them into context based on their relevance to what's going on. That's the gold right there. If you can get that working, then you have something that produces consistently interesting and relevant story, activity, conflict that drives the characters along through their adventures. So JJ, you put your hand up there.
Yeah, because what I see are two products coming out of that is beyond just the app experience.
Mhm.
The first one, to your point of facts versus memories. Um, on Monday, a newspaper of what's happened in the last week could come out, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And little articles on what one character did with another character, and if the memories generated a picture, right?
Mhm.
And that picture ends up being what's captured, right? Then, I mean, we could have what do you call it? One of those pictures of the guy getting arrested, it's like my character's in jail, right?
Yeah.
And in jail,
Love
right?
yeah.
And so here's what I think D&D people are going to love about this is their game lives beyond the game, right? It lives beyond the moment. D&D is like Native Americans painting in the sand. As soon as the painting is done, it starts to blow away, right?
Mhm.
And so memorializing their experiences in a newspaper could be all kinds of fun. And then later, um, you could create, once we have an AI that can digest and process these stories into video moments, there's another, asset that could be generated from that valuable story.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Tim.
What I'm seeing on your diagram here is if you started from session story, it's a loop, right? So your personal stories because you're part of some session, right? So it goes hierarchical in the sense that there's the world that exists, there are campaigns or sessions happening, and you personally participate in those sessions. But what I see is the sessions are what create. The sessions are based on some facts. They generate memories and new facts that then result in those reports that inform the world that then loops back to the session story. So I see them like just the way you drew it out. I would just see a line going around as a circle going from session story up and around, coming to world story, and then world story driving back to session story again, as far as a loop. It makes me think with the generating images, again, capturing. When you were talking memories, I said, well, memories are moments, right? And that's
Mm.
a great idea for people. They do their session, they take what we talked about, they take a photo of that moment, right? That they did it something. Well, now you have your news report, right? You have your little caption, your headline. We did this. We conquered so and so, or we broke so and so out of jail, right? Well, that's going to inform the world story, which will then generate new session stories. Um, so I don't know. That's
I
so that
I
way it's
I
not just a,
I think I think you've got it, right? I think you've got the mental model, and I'm going to resist the urge to go directly now to the state machine diagram that I made before this, because I want to stay with this for just another moment, and I want to talk about backstory in the context of that user experience of the user first joining the system. So they've met somebody in public, they bump phones, they've decided that they're friends. Keep in mind that that connection, as we've been discussing, that connection opens up the database of facts and memories that live in the personal story of that person that you just joined. And that person's association with the world is also an index of the ways in which that person has interacted with the world. And it opens up the access to all of the sessions that that person has ever participated in. So there's this enormous database of information that just cracks wide open the second one of those connections is made. And what that does is it creates this fertile ground on which to develop a backstory for the new person based on what? A very narrow set of questions that we ask that person about either who they are or who they want to be, right?
Yeah, I think who you are, and I actually like the idea of 9 boxes on the screen, and you click one of those boxes, so it's pictures, less words, more pictures, and so you've got I think race should be the first choice, right?
Mhm.
Who are you? And you've got a picture of a guy, an orc, a human, an elf, a kinder, or so those ones, and you just click that. Then the next one says, "What are you?" Right? I'm
Mhm.
a this, I'm a this, and so you've got those same pictures, fighter, magic user, whatever those different ones are. Most people who are associated with Dungeons and Dragons are going to immediately understand which character is which, right? But maybe we can put
Yeah.
a word on the bottom of which, whatever. Um, and um, and then I think male female is an important choice. Um, and I really think we follow Skyrim, which is just you got one side or the other, right? You just got a male character, left character. You could start with that. Um, um, and um, and then there's another element that we haven't talked about that I think influences backstory that could be incredibly valuable for dynamic story. It's also something we can kill. And that idea is alignment, right?
Uh-huh.
So that is really important
Yeah.
because a dungeon master should force their players to play the alignment of their character, right?
Yeah.
So you really have 2 lines of 3, right? And on top you have evil, neutral, good, and on the bottom you've got chaotic, neutral, lawful. And they can combine, the bottom can combine with the tops in any way, right? Um,
Yes. So it's a matrix,
it's a
right?
it's a
As I understand it,
That's right.
right?
So chaotic evil right? Chaotic neutral, chaotic good. My intention is good, but I'm chaotic, man. How I go about that, my decisions might be really stupid, right? Um, a lawful, even lawful evil, man. I'm Dr. Doom, right? I mean, I have an aberrant law process that's working in my head that I'm trying to
Right.
keep move forward. So what's lovely about having those, even if we just choose evil, neutral, or good, is that they flavor story big time,
Yeah.
right? And they
Yep.
flavor relationships big time. And it doesn't mean an evil character and a good character can't work together for their common goal.
Mhm. Yes. So keep or kill this. Oh, we're keeping this for sure. I'm so glad you brought this up because I've always really liked this feature of D&D and of role-playing games in general. I think it also really helps us to think of the fact that these things that we're defining for our player characters also apply to our non-player characters, which is an entirely a separate part of this mechanical thing. But it's very important, right? Because the AI dungeon master, such as it is going to have to invent the stories for these things. And something like alignment goes a long way to flavoring that, which is your point, right? Alignment really drives conflict and story and plot. And so, good. Tim, you got your hand up. Sorry.
So yeah, JJ, I love this. My question is, does a person actively choose this, or are the questions they're asked feed into the AI who's using this matrix to make that decision? Right? Because if we want them to go out in the world and do things, we want them to aspire, but we're evaluating them based on this matrix, like their performance, their choices and stuff. Well, now we can not only inform the story more dynamically, but we can guide them in a direction. So in other words, if they choose things that say, oh, I'm lawful and good, but their actions in the game are chaotic and neutral, then the AI not only has a framework to design story, but an intention with that story to get them to align with their uh, chosen identity, what they want to be, right? As an aspirational goal. Maybe it's too big, but I love the Matrix idea.
I've seen that. I've played that before, right? The idea that as you're playing, you're like, "Oh shoot, I'm an evil Jedi now. I made choices that made me evil, so I can't have that good power. I now have to have an evil power." Um,
Right, all
uh,
of a sudden you lose, there you go, because you lose this skill all of a sudden because of your past performance, not just because of storyline, but because of your contribution to the storyline or your participation. But I
I,
don't want to
I would,
deviate too much. But
I would like to speak to this just for a brief moment from an engineering standpoint. Um, I think we've all experienced at one time or another this feature of large language models in application, which is that they are imbued with ethical rules about what is good and what is bad behavior, at least as it relates to text generation.
mhm.
And so we know that we could rely to a certain extent on a prompt to sort of evaluate a narrative and then conclude whether or not the narrative describes one of these 9 characteristics and then whether or not that matches. However, I don't know that that's what we want the AI to do, right? I don't know if that is necessarily the game that we want the AI to be playing with our players, is that the AI would be getting to decide on a case by case basis whether or not you are behaving good or bad and change it. I have other reasons that I guess I'm not elaborating on right now that I want to say that. I feel like that's a domain for people, not for machines. I guess there's another side of that that argues that if we're ever going to have it simulate non-player characters, it has to do some of that work I just don't know if we want it making summary judgments about other people, and I don't know that we want to create a game based on that. But that's
What it was more if it was karmatic, right? In other words, if you're performing bad things, then in the storyline, bad things happen.
I
But
hear the
in other
Chinese
words,
have a
you don't
system
give
like
them
that.
you don't give them evil actions, but maybe
Yeah.
bad things happen. Like you got thrown in jail, or you just lost this thing, and it's like, oh, maybe I'm making poor decisions because
Sure,
the
sure.
story keeps
But
getting
and
worse for me.
I'll follow you where you're going here, but then I'm gonna try to nose this back up into
Right.
the user experience design conversation. But you know, I think just from a basic, I don't know, philosophical standpoint, karma shouldn't change your classification on this
Hmm.
scale. It shouldn't,
Agreed.
right? So if that was the point you were making, I might have missed it, but I don't like that's I wouldn't want to build an engine that does that either. So I do think though this is a fantastic conversation philosophically. But I want to nudge us. Oh, sorry, Warren. What you got? Thanks for coming,
Well, no,
Warren.
I don't want to interrupt you. You finish that thought, and then
No, no, no. I was just going to send us back. Please contribute to that
well,
the
maybe this
line of
actually,
discussion
I'm
we're having.
thinking, sorry, folks, I dropped into this conversation.
You did. Don't
20 minutes.
apologize. You always do that. I love that about you, but you never need to apologize.
I
Come and
do
go
have
as you
this class
please.
until quarter after, but I love this conversation. But I wanted to point out what really struck me when I first arrived was that there is a very interesting human intelligence or HI foundation for what you're describing in terms of, well, first of all, memories and facts. And there's a neurological basis for that distinction with which you might be familiar. One of the evolutionary oldest parts of the mammalian brain that became of course, the human brain is the hippocampus. And psychologists and neurologists define episodic memory as episodes in our lives. It's something that we participate in, an episode. And that's generally stored in the hippocampus. And the hippocampus developed in evolutionary history to code for space and time, episodes in our lives that happened at a particular time in a particular place. And if you think about it, place is particularly important because even in the most elemental circumstances, any any animal or early human would need to know where essential things were in their environment, where water was, where animals hunted might be acquired, where certain plants could be gathered, and so forth. So space is very, very important. So the hippocampus codes for space and time, but facts are distinguished out in terms of semantic memory. Semantic invokes language, of course, but also the facts. In other words, real parts of our environment that are not necessarily defined by our own experiences. And particularly the facts that become language are stored and processed in the temporal lobes along the side of the brain. So this distinction between memories and facts is kind of fundamental to the way our minds work. And of course, the hippocampus in the course of a day, and the anterior temporal lobes store and encode a large amount of uh, information in different episodes. And some of this is then consolidated and integrated during sleep. But when you talk about new characters coming into the picture, of course, this is like a prediction error. Something that is not expected, uh, and in life. I have this example that I use with my students talking about prediction errors and curiosity, which often come. My example is supposing you're visiting the parents of a friend of yours, and you can kind of walking through their house, and they invite you to sit down in the living room. And you expected, what you expect to see in the living room: comfy furniture, a couch, lamps, maybe a fireplace, so forth and so on. But there in the corner of the room is a toilet, just sitting there, fully exposed, fully functional, a toilet in the living room. Well, that's a prediction error, because it says, your mind goes, what on earth is the toilet doing in the middle of the living room? And that sparks curiosity. So, part of what it makes the mind so plastic is its ability to continually modify memories. And every, some I've read, some neuroscientists who say that every memory really represents a new formulation of what actually happened, in terms of what came next, and particularly what had a particular, an impact. That toilet in the corner of the living room. So I don't know. I was thinking about this as you were describing the dynamics of story, and the way in which the episodes and the facts of a story are stored, and how uh, new episodes strike it. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to offer that
No,
as
no, no. I
and
love it.
maybe
And
when you're talking about design, story design, it is very applicable. But I leave that up
yeah.
to you, Aaron.
Well, it's applicable in a couple of different ways. Thank you so much for stepping up to the mic and contributing to that. The two ways it's well, the one way it's really relevant to the story mechanics, this engine that we're talking about building, is the word that you used about consolidation, right? Because, you know, it's an information system. Storage is frankly unlimited at this point, right? We can create a discrete and granular history of every single thing that happens in this thing for all time. But that's not useful, right? It's not useful to have a database of 1,000,000 different hit point losses in combat between goblins and humans. What's useful is the consolidation of the semantic and the episodic to create these chunks of story. And that is what lives in the database. And that is what is contributed into the large language model context when we're prompting it to create whatever is next. We're saying this and this and this and this and this and this and this happened. What is next? That's always what we're saying to the large language model. So this role and the distinction I love between facts being semantic and memories being episodic. This is wonderful. Thank you so much for that. The other thing, real quick, that it made me think of was dreams and prediction errors and curiosity, and the way that this overlaps with machine learning and artificial intelligence, because I loved this no matter whether it's really all that true or not. But human minds and machine minds suffer from a similar problem, which is that as pattern recognition machines, sometimes we see things that are not there. We see something that's red and sized like this and lumpy, and we might mistake that as an apple. If you put, two dots, if you, if you take this shape, right, just like this. Oh, shoot. Come on, Aaron. These two things, right? What is that? It's a face, right? Always a face, eyes, nose, and mouth. It doesn't matter. That's all you need. And you get a face. That's what because our brains do that to us. And so dreams, one person I heard postulated that dreams are actually your mind's way of creating a bunch of random things to add into its collection of things that it recognizes, so that you don't fall into a trap of seeing faces everywhere. It breaks up the patterns. It's calculated noise generated so that your brain can do what it does best, which is see things that are relevant to you and drive you. And we do the same thing when we train artificial intelligences, because an artificial intelligence that is trained exclusively on red apples will start to see red apples everywhere. You have to have additional noise. And so there is something true there, Warren, about the mechanics of this machine. It's every once in a while we're going to have to drop a toilet into the living room, because if we don't, we will get 1,000 stories that all go the same way. they'll all be the same. They will become derivatives of derivatives, and there won't be anything interesting. So the large language models do a little bit of this already through a thing called temperature, where you can dial in the randomness that's used in the generation of what comes out next. That is actually a variable that we can choose, but there's probably more to it than that when we're really trying to get it to play with us in a sustained way. So thank you very much for that. Do you have any other thoughts about that, or
Well, just what you
JJ?
said, the way in which the mind can separate out what is relevant, sometimes just relevant to the moment or relevant to the larger story. I mean, think of yourself in at a reception, lots of people, lots of talking, lots of noise, but someone
Yeah.
comes into the room and calls your name. So out of all of this background noise, you hear something very meaningful.
Yep.
And so your mind has the ability to focus on that and suppress everything else.
Mhm.
And this is the ability to carry on a conversation in a crowded room, which many people, as they get older, lose and becomes more and more difficult. But that's a
Mm.
fundamental neurological process of being able to pick out and emphasize and focus on information that's relative. Well, you could say
Mhm.
relative to the story.
Mhm.
So
Well,
there are two things that this brought up for me. One is with Warren talking about the facts and the memories, right? If you've ever talked to somebody who's had an amazing Dungeons and Dragons experience, they'll unfortunately retell it to people who did not play the game, right? It's very difficult to listen to a Dungeons and Dragons game be retold, although people love to do it all the time, right? So, but that story is different from the one that they experience. They're embellishing, they're living
yeah.
it at a different level. So by us creating the newspaper moments, right? We're actually creating little adrenaline hits every time they see themselves, right? Arrested or a hero or whatever. We're reinforcing their story, and their story is growing in their head in ways that we can't predict, in subtle little and semantic ways, because they start associating with powerful words or empathetic words or things that start to make them feel a certain way or the other, right? One way or the other. So I wanted to bring up that I think that reinforces the idea of us building people's stories, because I tell people stories of Dungeons and Dragons games that I played till today. And I
Mhm.
don't care. I want them to listen because they're amazing stuff. But the other thing I wanted to bring up is there used to be a book series called Thieves World, and I'm pretty sure it was associated with Dungeons and Dragons, and it was one city, and all these different famous artists, famous authors wrote a character in Thieves World, right? And those characters interacted in each other's stories. So they picked up the world story like you're talking about, right? And incorporated each other into their stories. Um, and it was one of my favorite things to read, because I could care about characters and watch other people deal with them, right? Other authors deal with them, and stay
Mhm.
true to that character. And
Mhm.
I can see the implications from one author's story impacting another at the same time in a way that was unpredictable. Um, so here's what I started. So here's when Warren was talking about places and people having emotional connections, right? Part of it is their imagination needs to know who they are and where they are before they can decide what they're doing, right? We need a scaffolding to hang the logic of a reality. And it very often starts with a space. So, I mean, the question I have is, then every mall just a random mall, or is every mall one mall in Thieves World, right? Um, I mean, are we taking the entire United States? I mean, there's a game that was built by D&D that used Chicago as the map. You just didn't recognize it really, because who knows what Chicago looks like. Um, but so we can map over the United States, make everything real, or we can make a city that everything lives inside of. And that may be much easier for us to say, okay, you're in the bazaar. Whenever you're in the mall, you're in the bazaar, right? Um, or we can generate a real a map and then just locate people.
So rather than try to make a decision about the size of the thing right now, I think though what you've encouraged me to do is imagine that there might be a fourth type of story or a type of story that's subordinate to world stories that are place stories, right? And that there might be more details there about the bazaar, but that the world itself is not defined by the bazaar and vice versa, right? Shaped by it maybe, but not constrained by it. So I think that um, I want to sort of plant a flag on that. You've brought that up, the other aspect of that being the geolocation nature of it, and where you're standing at the time that you're playing is in some way informing the story that you're having. And I grant you that that's also very interesting. There's one final thing I want to do here. We've got 3 minutes left on the clock. Skills we've given them, class they've chosen, race they've chosen, gender they've chosen, alignment they've chosen. But the question for the group is, do these four things, and I think the skill is dictated by some selection here, do these four things alone constitute enough to get that player playing in the game? Or do we need something else? Because my gut says we need something else. We need some kind of seed to inform and sort of randomize that person's story, but I don't know what it is.
So, and I would like for us to continue this conversation. This is really fantastic. I think we need to establish, um, uh, we may need to establish their abilities: strength, dexterity, constitution, charisma, right? Um, and we might do something like give them a standard roll, everybody's average, and then each thing they get to up one, or you know what I mean. So they get to add as they go. Because I like the evolution and not, and I think evolution also keeps them invested versus everything up front. We also need an armor class. Part of that armor class could be defined by their abilities. What's their dexterity? Are they faster, so their armor class is lower? Um, then we need to define, and their armor class can be based on decisions, right? At the end of each thing, if they get to choose between putting on a helmet or grabbing a dagger, right? And to adding one of those two things to their kit, the armor will change their armor class, but the dagger gives them a weapon and a higher, damage, right? Because we're going to need to figure out the armor class is, what do you need to roll over in order to hit the person? And then we need to know, and if we simplified it that way, everybody has to roll over this, unless you have a +1 sword or a
Mhm.
+1 arrow. And then you get 2 hits or 1 hit, and it's either a fireball or whatever. And then that can grow over time, but we're not thinking about all those mechanics as we get this going too.
I agree with all that, and I'll just say this. I think that random number generation with dice is a thing that people will want to have in this. I don't believe in the idea of doing that in the background and just going, you roll a 20. There should be something tangibly visible, maybe even using the haptics of the device that they're carrying with them to connect them with that idea. I think that's just that important. And yes, to all the other things you were saying about abilities and skills and armor, I think we might be able to infer those things from their choices of class and race and gender. Whether or not we give them choices within that is, again, back to what do we assign to you versus what do you choose for yourself? And that's a great conversation to have. So we've reached our time for the day, but I want to come back one more time to the question of seed. And I want us to sort of land there. And I'll give you an example of what I mean just to make sure everybody understands. But, all these other things have been just choices. What is your class? What is your race? What is your gender? What is your alignment? None of them have been open-ended questions. And Tim offered one that we might consider, which is, who do you want to be? What do you want to get out of this experience? what is the worst thing that ever happened to you? What is the best thing that ever happened to you? Um, when did you fall in love? What there's got to be something that we can put into that backstory generator so that it is not just creating derivative noise every time, but is actually creating something that the player will connect with. And maybe this is where we stop and everybody gets to think about that question for next time. But I think that's if there has to be that, I think, in order to launch the person forward. Um,
Aaron, thank you for joining us again today. This is very exciting. I love watching the evolution, all the thoughts that come out of this. Warren, thank you for your contribution, and Tim. Everybody, I hope you enjoyed your lunch, and we'll see you again soon. Please, if anybody needs anything or if you want to contribute, reach out through Next Wave Network, and we'll talk to you all soon. Thanks.
Thank you,
Thanks,
JJ
Aaron.
and Aaron, everyone. Great conversation. Great